And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of the Assembly Call, one of our last preseason episodes before the games start to count, and we like to think these shows start to count a little bit more than these preseason episodes. But we wanted to do a couple more shows before the season begins, and so that's why we're here tonight. Andy is here. Ryan is off for the evening. You can send him tweets and wish him well after another rough loss for his San Diego Chargers this past weekend. We weep for him. And Will has a big class project, so he is hard at work getting his work done. Marnie Mooney would be very happy, Will, that you have prioritized your schoolwork over a random off-season episode of the Assembly Call. So we're very proud of you. But with that said, we are happy that you all are here live. We're happy that you are listening to us on the podcast. And tonight, what we want to do in this season preview edition is go through the individual players and just talk a little bit about them. Kind of the way that we're going to do it is we'll set the stage with talking about what the general expectations are, and then just give our gut feeling for whether we think a guy will exceed, match, or maybe fall below expectations. And it's just a gut feeling. Obviously, no one knows for sure, but it's just a way to frame talking about these players. And those of you who are here live, please feel free to use the chat to let us know what you think about each player. So that's what we'll do. But we'll start out, as we normally do, with a banner moment and with a bottoms line to get us going here. And I think these will be pretty quick. The banner moment for me simply is the season's getting ready to start. Hoosier Hysteria is coming on Saturday, which means that the excitement from the off season will reach its peak, and then soon thereafter we have games that count. And I think I had a conversation on Twitter with a guy, maybe it was yesterday or today, whenever it was, just basically talking about the importance when you're a program like Indiana of getting to the tournament every single year, because you never know once you get to the NCAA tournament how the draw can fall your way, just like we saw in 2002 with the Hoosiers that weren't expected to be an NCAA finalist, but were. And I think what's really exciting about this season is that this year's team clearly has the talent that if they coalesce as we think they will, if they can avoid major injury, obviously, but if they can just get into the tournament and get a good draw, this could be a special season. And so for any season that begins like that, just getting the season started is enough of a banner moment to get going with, because it could very well be a banner season in Bloomington, but we will have to see. With that said, Andy, over to you for a bottoms line, and then we'll start breaking down each of the players on the roster.
Yeah, I might be even quicker than you. I'm in exactly the same place that you are. Excited for Hoosier Hysteria this weekend and a chance for people to get their first look at this team and some of the new players and see what that looks like. And other than that, just really trying to soak up as much of the preseason content with media days and all those kinds of things, and at least starting to put my head around some potential early bracketology stuff. So just looking through some of the different projections and things like that is definitely an exciting time. I think Brian Thompson, he put it best. I'm not a Cubs fan, so I don't have that part of the pain, but any IU football fans out there after the past weekend, I luckily was at a wedding, so did not get to watch the second half collapse. But I think there's a lot of people looking for something positive in the general area of the country where IU fans can be found. So hopefully a little basketball talk will get everybody in a better mood.
Yeah, no, the focus on basketball escalated quickly because we're only a couple weeks removed from Indiana being undefeated and taking Ohio State down to the wire, and obviously the Cubs down 0-3 and losing 6-0 at last check in Game 4. So if you're a Cubs fan over here, we appreciate you coming and taking some solace in the Assembly Call here for a little bit, and we hope that by the time the show is over, for your sake, that the Cubs have made a comeback and that the rest of that game is exciting. But in the meantime, we will try and entertain you and educate you with some IU basketball talk here. So let's jump right to it, and let's start right at the top. Let's start with Yogi Ferrell. And I think it's fair to say that the expectations for Yogi are another year of growth, because he's a guy who has improved in pretty much every statistical category every single season. And it's fair to say that the expectations are first team All Big Ten, a guy who is competing all season in the discussion for Big Ten Player of the Year, and a guy who is at a minimum a third-team All-American, possibly challenging for a second-team All-American or even a first-team All-American spot. I think he's earned those expectations, and that is the baseline for him. My expectation for Yogi is that he matches that. I'm not really sure what Yogi can do this season to exceed the expectations because they're so high, but I also don't think the expectations are unfair. And probably more than any other Hoosier, I feel really confident in him matching those expectations because I think he's capable, and I think he has shown us through 3 seasons that he will continue to improve individually. Now, what will be able to take this team to the next level is if his leadership takes the next step. And so I think that's what will be really important to see is if Yogi, the leader, can lead this team. And if he can do that, now I think he exceeds what even the highest expectations are of him coming into the season. But he's definitely a guy that I look to match even the already very high expectations. What do you think of Yogi for the season?
Yeah, I would echo what you said there. I think I think it would have to be pretty special, which it's not that he's not capable of that to really exceed those, but you look at some of those preseason rankings and things like that coming in. I think those are fair of him, and I think we've seen him over the course of his 3 years do a lot of things. I think one of the things I feel like we've talked about a lot over the course of doing the show is being able to have enough guys that what you can expect from them on a night in, night out basis. And I think he's at a point where we've got a pretty good idea of what we can expect. I think the things that I'll be looking for this year, in addition to the leadership component that you mentioned, is how he sets the tone defensively. We've seen him certainly at times be a really good defender and show that in stretches and even for full games. Now we need to see it for multiple games, for a full season and those kinds of things, because I think everybody's beaten the dead horse all off season long in terms of how important defense is to this team. It's no secret at all, and I think to be able to see him set the tone for that will be really important. And the other thing to look at for me is some of the recent chatter about him trying to play off the ball a little bit more, and I think that's something that maybe saves him energy in some ways, but also provides him different ways where he can he can score and kind of show the various skills that he's had. As we've talked about a lot, he's played a lot of different roles on the team, and I think might be able to see a little bit of that this year, maybe inside of games as opposed to from season to season.
Yeah, and I agree with some of these comments here, like from Trenton. Yogi exceeds expectations by winning an NCAA championship, and I do think for Yogi, how we view his senior season will in a lot of ways be based on how the team does. And when you're a senior point guard and you've shown as much as he has, I think that's fair. And so I don't think the team has to win a Big Ten title or has to get to, an Elite Eight or a Final Four for us to look back fondly on Yogi's senior season and think he pulled his weight. But again, I agree that for him to exceed those expectations and maybe even take that next step from, truly great Indiana player to, maybe even legendary status or, top 15, top 10 player, maybe. I mean, those things are out there if he can have a great season. But that obviously is really going to be exceeding those expectations. And that would be putting this team on his back and carrying him all the way. So we'll see. It's within the realm of possibility. Can he do it? That's part of what makes this season so exciting. But also what gives you a little bit of confidence is that you have a guy like that who is in the lead that you feel comfortable could do it. And now we have the fun of seeing if he does. Now, obviously, part of what he's going to have to do is lead some of the younger guys. And so let's start talking about them. And let's start with James Blackman Jr. And I think, Blackman's such an interesting case because I think the expectations for him in some ways have been unfair just because we expected so much from him. And yet I also think some of the criticisms have been very fair because, he's a guy who did score 15 points last year as a freshman, which is what Jay Edwards did as a freshman. And yet we know from watching all the games that there were games that he just wasn't much of a factor. And there were games where his defense was severely lacking. And, so I think the expectations for him are that he at least matches or possibly exceeds that scoring. I think the Big Ten Network set the expectations pretty high by placing him among the top 10 players in the conference as an all Big Ten type player. And I'm concerned about that. James is a guy that I fear may struggle to live up to the expectations this year. And I think part of it is, the injury that may have sapped some of his momentum from the offseason. We're not in practice, so we don't know that for sure. But I just, you know how important some of those off-season workouts are and just getting in the swing of things and making progress. And I just wonder if he's now just working to get back to that normal level and how that may affect him come the season. We don't know. But I just think the expectations this season may continue to outpace the results. But he's a guy that I have really high hopes for if he stays as an upperclassman. Once he adds maturity and a true understanding of what it means to be a great player on both ends. And I just wonder if this is still too much of a transition season for us to see that greatness. I still think he'll be a very good player. I think he has a good chance to lead this team in scoring. But I don't see an all Big Ten type season. I don't see that kind of transcendent season that sends him into the NBA thinking he's a first round pick. What do you think about James this year? What are your expectations for him?
Yeah, it's funny as I thought about different players and the question that you had thrown out. His was one of the hardest ones for me to really figure out, and I think in some cases I feel like I may end up saying this a lot. It probably depends on whose expectations you're talking about. I think there's a couple of challenges for him. I think one is while he's certainly shown the ability to score, did that with a lot of consistency in the non-conference last year and was a bit more up and down, had one single-digit scoring game in the non-conference and I think 6 or 7 in Big Ten play. I think that's a factor, but I also think this team doesn't necessarily need him to score 20 points a game. While he certainly can do that, I don't know that that's necessary. And so I think people whose expectations are more aligned with him maybe leading this team in scoring, I don't know that he does that, but I also don't know that he needs to do that. And I think that's, kind of where it becomes difficult for me. I can certainly see scenarios where he would live up to that, second team All Big Ten. He certainly showed last year that he can do that. And can score in a number of different ways, being able to get to the free throw line and things like that. I do just, it's just, I think there's a pretty wide range of outcomes for him. And I think, again, if you go back to do I know what I can expect from, you on a given night? I don't think we know that from him yet. I don't think we know that from him offensively. We certainly don't know it defensively after last year. And I think that if there's one area that I'm looking at, outside of the general consistency, it's obviously the defense. As much as I said we've beaten a dead horse on this, we'll probably continue to do it during this. But I think he's one that I just don't know that we have a great baseline of here's exactly what we're going to get out of him every night. And that makes me lean toward maybe he's not going to get to those expectations. But he also has the talent and is going to get the playing time because his team isn't particularly deep at guard. That if he has worked on those things and plays well, he could play himself onto the first team. So I just think there's a pretty wide range of outcomes for him. The consistency factor kind of pushes me, I guess, more to the low side of the expectations.
Yeah, and Cameron makes a good point here about taking pressure off of JBJ should strengthen his shot selection, and that could be huge for him as if he understands what's a good shot and what's not, when to attack and what's not, and he really struggled with that as a freshman. And I think there were some games when his shot was off and he just kept pushing it. There are some guys I wonder if they can be comfortable not being the leading scorer or being the leading shot taker. And I think he's a guy who some games needs to step his foot off the throttle a little bit more, and not be quite so aggressive and pick his spots a little more. And that's something that if he can mature in that way as a sophomore, and hopefully he can really help him be an even more efficient scorer. But again, he is the hardest guy because the expectations are so strange. And in some ways, he was really underrated last year. In some ways, he was overrated. It's just very, very strange. And so it's going to be interesting to see how he responds this year. Let's talk about his other freshman or sophomore now, backcourt mate. Good point, too, by CW about his rebounding being an unexpected bright spot. And if he can add defense to that this year, then it won't be all about the scoring with him, which is what we got a little bit too caught up with last year. Let's talk about Robert Johnson. He is a guy who really struggled with turnovers and decision-making last year, and I think really struggled at times knowing what speed to play with and matching his speed to the game situation. Would go too fast at times, and then other times he would almost be a little bit slow and be tentative. And I think the biggest thing I want to see from him, in addition to a more consistent jump shot and, of course, defense, which goes without saying for all of these guys, is just a little bit better understanding of where to pick his spots, a little bit more of a comfort level within the flow of the game. And I think Robert Johnson is kind of the polar opposite of James Blackman Jr., where people almost forget he was a top 50 recruit and how much talent he has. And he always seems to kind of fly under the radar, and the expectations aren't quite as high. He averaged, like 9 points a game last year. I don't know if he needs to improve that. I think he could have an even better season, even by scoring fewer points when you add a guy like Thomas Bryant to the mix. But I think what you really want to see for him to exceed expectations, I don't think he's going to be an all Big Ten player or anything like that. But if he can limit those turnovers and increase the assists and really be a facilitator while getting that 3-point percentage to about 40-45% because he's taking smarter shots and he's more consistent, now he becomes a huge part of what this team is trying to do. And if he can even become a stopper type defender where you can put him on a guy and he can really lock him up, that would be huge too. I look for Robert Johnson to basically about meet expectations. As a sophomore, I think, the expectations of him taking that next step, I think he will. And he's a guy I have high hopes for as a junior and senior. But I do expect steady progression from him this year. And to me, that for him will meet expectations. What do you think of Robert?
Yeah, with him, I don't, and I feel like I'm, I don't want to say like enamored with him, but I do feel like there's a lot of things to like about his game and a lot of the little things that that really successful teams have. They always have a guy that can kind of do a little bit of everything, and he feels like that guy to me. So I probably lean a little bit more toward exceeding with him. I think big things to watch, like you said, turnovers are a big one, and a lot of that becomes one, if Yogi's going to play off the ball a bit more, that becomes really important for him. And two, somebody mentioned this earlier in the chat, and it's now gone, so I don't have it handy. But just kind of talking about backup point guard when Yogi's not on the floor, who Robert Johnson seems to be the guy that has to assume that role based on who's out there. That's not a role that you really see Zeisloff playing. It's not a role you really see Blackman playing. And quite honestly, at that point, it's really all the guards that you have. And so I think it's going to be really key for him. And it's funny to look at some of the turnover numbers now, and even looking back just at the game log. I think Alex said this on one of the podcasts with you, that when you watched him play, it didn't necessarily feel like he was making a lot of bad decisions or a lot of turnovers and things like that. And I kind of felt the same way, but I mean, the numbers are what they are. And so, clearly those things were happening, and you really look at some of his advanced metrics when you got into Big Ten play. I mean, he was really up and down, and a lot more down than up from an efficiency standpoint. So I agree with you in the sense that I don't know that he's going to score any more than he did last year, and may in fact score less. But as we start to think about, X factor kind of things for this team, I know Holt was a guy that people threw out a lot, early on in the offseason. I think for me, the more I think about it and the more I look at this team, that Johnson really becomes that guy. So I might be leaning more toward exceeds, because that's what I want to happen, because I think if he does exceed those expectations, that's really a huge boost to the team.
It's a great point too about him really having to be the backup ball handler when Yogi is out, and Yogi's a guy who plays a lot of minutes and sometimes will go all the way, but there's going to have to be someone that steps up in that leadership role with the ball in their hands when he's off the court. And I mean, you're right. If it's not him, who is it? So that's an excellent point. All right, let's talk about Troy. Someone just mentioned in the chat, Troy may bring the ball up. We saw that last year. Let's say this in defense of Troy, a guy who, in his freshman year, the turnovers were just so awful. Last year he showed improvement. And I think this is the year now. Look, we've compared Troy to Victor ever since he came in. Yes, it's terribly unfair, but the comparisons will stay. And now this is Troy's junior year. And we know about the offseason camps that he went to. And, he didn't go pro. He came back and all these different things. And I've been extremely bullish on Troy. Let me say this. I think the expectations for Troy, he didn't, in that list of the Big Ten players, in their kind of first two teams, top 10 players, Troy wasn't in there. I look at the expectations for Troy, just the baseline expectations to be, continue to make improvement. I think, what did he score last year? It was like 12 points and 7 boards a game. Am I right on that? Somewhere around there, 12, 13 points, 7 boards. It was something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I've got the Pomeroy numbers up, so
I know,
that doesn't actually have that doesn't have that on there, but I think that seems about right.
Yeah, and really, I think the expectation is really for him to maintain those numbers. I think with what we've added, with how the composition of the team looks, but to be more efficient. To cut down on the turnovers and to play better defense and really to pass the eye test more on defense, because Troy and James Blackman Jr. were the two guys who failed the eye test on defense more than probably any other Hoosiers last year. So I think when you look at the expectations for Troy, a third team all Big Ten type selection, maybe honorable mention, that kind of thing, maintaining those numbers. I made some crazy claims earlier in the offseason about how he's, a dark horse pick for Big Ten MVP and a lot of that. And let me say this. Tom Crean said something in a recent press availability that concerned me a little bit. Talking about, he really lauded some guys about just their gym ratness and how they're always in the gym and they're always there. And he mentioned something about how Troy has a long way to go to be like Victor in those terms. And probably everybody does. But it still seemed a little bit to me like, the coach was wanting a little bit of just that desire, that work ethic. And maybe it's unfair for me to say that because we're not there and I'm just extrapolating from what Crean said. But, I guess I was looking maybe for that next step. And maybe, when Tom Crean's making comments about his leadership for Troy to be a kind of guy who can step into that, none of the things that we can see from, our 30,000 mile away view seem to suggest that. And so in the absence of that, I'm going to back off a little bit on my Troy for Big Ten MVP talk and be a little bit more reasonable and say he's a guy I think meets expectations. I think he did enough last year in improving on his weaknesses from one year to the next and had opportunities in the offseason to play against good players and has the maturity now of understanding what the NBA really wants from him. And that clearly is a goal for him to, I think, improve in the way that we expect him to improve. So for him, failing expectations is keeping the same numbers and not making any improvement. Meeting expectations would be reasonable growth from sophomore to junior year, and that's what I think we'll see from him. But that giant leap that we may hope for and that we've seen from guys like Oladipo under Crean, I don't have the same confidence level that we get that, but I still think we get a really, really good season, a third-team All-Big Ten type season, and I think that's pretty much in line with what people expect. Your thoughts on Troy?
Yeah, I'd end up pretty close to where you are. I think the things that we want to see the most from him are the things that you really can't get a good handle on until the games start. And some of these things, the defense that you talked about, and even the jump shooting. That's been a big issue. The way rotates his lower body and his legs kind of end up not facing the basket. I think something that Purdy's worked hard on. I think Cameron even mentioned this. How talking a lot about trying to shoot more. Get better from 3-point range. And is that really what he needs to do? And he's one, I think, that this isn't a commentary on him. I think this is a commentary on a lot of college players of, I know what I need to do and what I need to show to people in the NBA. How does that fit in with what I need to do for my team to be successful? But those are things, again, his jump shot could be markedly better, and we have no way of knowing that at this point. So I think that's what I really want to watch for. It's not necessarily that he scores more points, but if he scores the same amount of points, how does he go about getting those? Because I think, between that and the defense are really the question marks. I was looking at the Pomeroy stats. I was pretty amazed by the fact that, some of his defensive rebounding statistics and even offensive rebounding statistics are really, really impressive. Second best defensive rebound percentage in the conference and during conference play of anybody. That's incredibly impressive. His free throw rate was 15th best. So, he really did make a lot of progress. I know sometimes that progress felt overshadowed by the, don't do that, Troy facepalm moments that we all had at times. But again, it's just kind of continuing to build on those strengths, maybe add a little bit more to his game. But I guess maybe somewhat selfishly, for me and the team success, I feel like I wanted to just see him do the same things he did last year, just better and more efficiently, as you said. And if he mixes in a jump shot here and there, that's fine. But I don't know that, this team ends up being terribly successful if he's shooting, 6 or 7 jump shots a game. So I think that's a delicate balance. I think that's one of the things with, so many guys who are in that conversation for going to the NBA who got that feedback, know what they need to work on. The interesting thing for me is to see kind of what they do with that feedback and how that manifests itself in the game.
And he can't have games like the Michigan State game, where he's basically a total non-factor and gets benched. Like junior Troy Williams cannot do that anymore. That's unacceptable, and I'm sure he would even admit that. Here's the thing about shooting is, going into Victor's junior year, if he was ever going to get on the NBA radar, he had to show that he could shoot. And he did that as a junior. And, the coaches gave him the green light. And what did he shoot? 45, 46% from three. I think he might have even shot 50% from three his junior year. And I do worry a little bit that, and this is where, Tom Crean's handle on this team and the internal leadership and everything is going to have to come in too. I mean, if Troy's shot is improved and he's getting those opportunities, great. But what if it isn't improved and yet he still wants to take those shots to show that he can make them? That's a balance that's going to have to be struck when you have an offense that's this potent, and you've really got to be sure that you're getting the best shot each possession. So that's just something to watch out for, that we know he's going to want to show off, but those shots also have to start falling to keep them. Oladipo was making them. Will Troy be able to do that? Something to watch for.
Yeah. I was looking back at Victor's stats from that year, and he shot 130 free throws, 236 2-pointers, and 68 3-pointers, and made 30 of them. So he was at 44%. So he did shoot really well. I think a lot of them felt like they were timely, but he didn't take a ton of shots from there, and still really focused in on. I mean, he shot 64% from 2-point range, and he didn't take a lot of mid-range shots. A lot of his was going to the basket. I mean, I think. Maybe that mix of roughly, I don't know, between maybe 40-ish%. It seems like of his shots were 3-pointers. Or no, I'm sorry, that's not at all accurate math. A little, maybe like 30% were 3-pointers. I think Troy's needs to be probably a little bit lower. But when you couple sprinkling in a handful of threes that you show the ability to make with some consistency, but still just relentlessly attacking the basket as Victor did, during that season, and as Troy can do and has done at times over the course of his IU career. I think those are the kinds of things you'd want to see. So if you want to look for parallels, maybe it's that kind of shot mix, and the quality of those shots that I wouldn't mind seeing.
I mean, and he's such a spectacular player. He can be such a huge driving force for this team. And if he's making better decisions, he can take this team from good to great, if he makes that jump. And so that's certainly possible, and I hope we see it. But he's, obviously all of it's uncertain, but he's definitely a guy that if he can do that, it's going to have such a huge impact on this team. Let's talk about TB. Let's talk about Thomas Bryant, who we expect to be the fifth member of the starting five. Trying to project what a freshman can do is a difficult thing. I thought Alex put it really well on the podcast on the Brink episode that we did, because I asked him, and someone on Twitter actually asked us this question earlier. How does Thomas Bryant fit in comparison to Noah Vonleh and Cody Zeller? And, as a freshman, the impact as a freshman. And Alex said, right in between those guys. He's not going to have the immediate impact of a guy like Zeller, but I think Noah, who was obviously a very talented player, that didn't translate to making his teammates better. Whereas Cody, even though he took a lot of criticism his freshman year, if you think back to it, I think people, expected even more from him than he gave. He still made all of his teammates around him better and was such a terrific player for that system. And I think Thomas Bryant fits in, I think, in between those. And I think that's the expectation for him. But I actually expect him, if he can stay healthy, and that's the big question, because we know he's been dealing with a problem with the arch in his foot, and goodness gracious knows, every time we hear about anything like that with an IU big man, it makes us all really cautious. But I actually expect Thomas Bryant to exceed that expectation by a little bit. I think he's a guy, you look at the, expectation, maybe 9-10 points, 8-9 boards a game. And I think he's a guy who can do that, but maybe a little bit more. And I think his exceeding that expectation will come almost as much from the energy and the attitude as it will from what you actually see in the stats, because everything that you read about this guy and that you hear about this guy is that his energy has a big impact on the team, his attitude, his work ethic. I watched there was a great scouting video about him from Draft Express, and it talked about how he's not the greatest athlete. He's not a fast twitch type guy, but he works so hard and he plays in a stance. Like, he really seems to do the little things that can take a good, talented player and turn them into a great player. Will he be a great player as a freshman? No, he'll be inconsistent. He'll be a lot of things. But I think he's a guy who, even with the expectations he has, I'm really bullish on Thomas Bryant. And with health, I think he can slightly exceed those expectations and be closer to Cody Zeller than Noah Vonleh if we're comparing our McDonald's All-American big men from the Crean era. What are you expecting from Mr. Bryant?
Yeah, this is definitely one of those. I think it depends on what your expectations are. I listened to that part of the podcast, and when, Alex said, 12 points, 7, 8 rebounds, I mean, that feels about right to me. I think the difference between him and the other guys coming in was those guys had to produce. I think Bryant has to give them a good chunk of minutes, and I know you guys touched a little bit on some of the foul trouble and those kinds of things and how important those would be. But if you think about when Zeller came in, it was at such a time in the program where he had to come in and produce. He was such a big recruit, meant a lot more than just getting him in an IU uniform. And he was able to not really buckle under the pressure of that. And Vonleh, because of all the guys that left before he went there was a lot expected of him, and he had to produce. He had to score. The gripe that entire year was they got to get him the ball more. They need him to score. They need to do all these things. While it's certainly not going to hurt to have Bryant score, I also don't know that, again, with the other firepower and the offense around him, to have him score 10 points a game, I think is fine. I don't feel like he needs to score, 15, 18 points a game like I feel was the expectation when some of those other guys came in, maybe for different reasons. But so I think that's kind of an important distinction in terms of what those expectations are. I think from my standpoint, expectations are, around that, 10, 12 points, 7, 8 rebound type thing, but really just logging consistent minutes, giving them, good solid defense in the post and just staying on the floor, because I think the threat of him and his activity level and all those things that he's really been credited with, as he comes onto the team, becomes super important, and the ability to keep him on the floor is just is going to be huge. The threat that provides, and a threat that just didn't exist on last year's team in the way that it needed to. So maybe it's just the threat of him is as important as what he actually does, I think. And the longer he can keep himself on the floor, I think the better off everybody's going to be. So he definitely was another one that was hard for me, because I think there's a lot of people that are labeling him with those kinds of, Zeller, comparisons. I think some of that comes from the way he runs the floor and all those kinds of things, but he doesn't need to do what Zeller did. And I don't think he needs to do what was expected of Vonleh that he didn't really produce on a consistent basis either. So, he's one, I think, just a steady, solid, again, can I know what I'm going to get out of this guy night in, night out? Can I feel confident that I'm going to get 30 minutes, 12 points, and 7 rebounds out of him every night? Then I'm going to be really happy with that.
Yeah, well, and he gives us a big guy that has some defensive awareness. I'll link to this Draft Express video in the show notes. But, he's a guy that knows what to do defending a pick and roll. There were times last year where it felt like Colin Hartman was our only big man, quotes, big man, who had any awareness of where to be playing defense. And to actually have a guy with size who seems to have some awareness, and again, he's a freshman, so he'll go through, he's going to have some growing pains. But I think he's got some intangibles that are going to help his learning curve not be quite as steep. And that's why I'm excited about him. But again, the health has got to be there. So we hope he's fully healthy. All right. So we've gone about a half hour. Andy, are you okay on time if we do rapid fire?
Yeah, let's do rapid fire for the rest of the other, 5 or so guys that we want to hit. Yeah.
Okay. So let's do rapid fire. And actually, I'll just set the stage and you give me your thoughts on him. Okay. So let's start with Colin Hartman. Obviously, he's dealing with a rib injury right now. I think the general expectations for him, not an all Big Ten type guy, but to be a glue guy, to do Colin Hartman things, and to basically be a Swiss Army knife that Tom Crean can count on. I will say I think the expectations are closer to what we saw at the beginning of Big Ten season than when he really struggled at the end of Big Ten season last year. To do that for a full season, I think, is the expectation for Colin Hartman.
Yeah, I think we talked a lot last year about part of it coming back from his previous knee injury and things like that. But it seemed like there were times that the more he played, just the more he wore down. And I think that's reasonable to expect for a guy who came into the season, one, coming off a knee injury, 2, not expecting to have to play the extensive minutes that he did, and 3, not having to expect to spend those minutes on the floor banging with big guys and being a center on this team. So I think getting him back to a more natural position is going to be key. And again, we talked last year, and you mentioned a minute ago, defensive awareness wise, he was one of the better ones. The ability to pull other teams' big guys away from the floor and make threes is going to be huge. And just a good solid program guy who does all the little things. Again, kind of in the same Robert Johnson type mold. Those are the kinds of guys that are going to win you games, win you close games, guys that you can rely on to make the smart play. And he proved last year that he was that guy. And I think seeing him, unfortunate about the rib injury, but another, off season's worth of rehab from the knee should be that much stronger. So I expect, a lot of good things from him. And again, kind of like you said, similar to what we saw before he was thrust into the starting set.
Yeah, hey, maybe he'll be the backup point guard for Yogi. Why not, right? I mean, who expected him to play backup center last year? Let him play point guard. He can be the Jose Akendo of IU basketball. If anybody gets that reference, I give you props. You got it. Okay.
I'm all.
Yeah. All right, let's go to Nick Zeisloft. Obviously, he was the designated three-point marksman last year, and you just hoped that he gave you more on offense than he gave up on defense, because despite his best efforts, he was abused by Big Ten offenses. I think the expectation for Zeisloft, frankly, is a similar offensive season to what we saw last year, which may be difficult for him to do because, what was he, the highest rated player in KenPom? But I think that's what people expect with some improved defense. I mean, a little bit of improved awareness to compensate for his physical limitations, but just not getting so obviously abused like he did last year. I think that's the baseline for Zeisloft. Do you think he can live up to it?
Yeah, I do. I think they've talked a little bit in the offseason about him trying to, be able to do a little bit more off the dribble, a little bit more, mid-range to expand, what he can do. He shot 143s last year and 18 twos. So going back to that kind of ratio. That
sounds like my high school career.
So I do think, I don't see him shooting a ton more twos, but I do think for him to be able to diversify what he does and the threat that he provides offensively, but at the same time, to continue to be able to knock down those open shots, IU has guys that are going to draw defensive attention, get in the lane, whether that's Bryant drawing a double team in the post, Yogi being able to penetrate, Blackman being able to penetrate, and being able to kick out to him. So I think the same thing, and I think he's another guy where, potentially logging a few less minutes on a night in, night out basis. There were some games last year when they went 4 guards. He just played a ton. And I think, he's another guy who might benefit from not having to log, upper 20s in minutes wise, where you get him, 18 minutes a night. He comes out and plays well. So defensively, certainly look for some improvement from him, as with everybody. But to me, I think if he can continue to do what he did last year and knock down open threes reliably, I think he's a great role player to have coming.
Max Bielfeldt. I think the main expectation for him is just solid, steady, a solid, steady big guy off the bench that isn't going to make the big mistake, is going to bang and get some rebounds. Offensively, it's going to be interesting to see how he fits. I know I've heard some mention of Yogi talking about how, there's been some times that, in pick and roll, as he's expected Max to roll and Max wants to step out and kind of be a shooter. How will that mesh with this team and how it wants to play? That'll be interesting to see. But I think just a 5-6 point score, get 5-6 rebounds a game, but just be a steady influence off the bench. I think that's the main, and provide some leadership is the main expectation. Do you think he comes in and does that, or do you think there's any type of fit concerns that might make it so he struggles to fill that role this year?
I feel like he's a great fit, and I was trying to think as I thought about him, when the last time that IU actually had an experienced big man coming off the bench was, and I think that's just such a huge factor for this team, to be able to have somebody who's has Big Ten experience, has played in some tough games, has played in tough environments, maybe hasn't played a ton of minutes in those environments, but has that experience, has been on successful teams that he can fall back on, because so many times it's Honor, throw him out there. You've got all these other young big guys that have kind of rotated through, and not a lot of them have stuck, and you've had different things that way. I just don't remember the last time that there was a guy who, while doesn't have experience with this team, with this set of players, that actually has that experience they're able to fall back on. So I think he's a really important player. I think he probably is a guy I feel comfortable in saying exceeds expectations, just because I think his role will be defined pretty easily. And I think as he looked at potential schools to go to, nothing with how things have played out with this team in the offseason has really changed anything about what his role would have been. So I have to think it's been pretty clear for him coming in. Here's what we're going to need you to do. Some nights he might be asked to log 20 minutes when they play a team with a bunch of big guys like Purdue. Some nights it may be less, but to be able to go in and bang, really play hard on the boards, and again, solid defender, positioning, all those kinds of things that this team has lacked. You'd like to think a guy with the experience that he has at a big-time program like Michigan will definitely pay dividends, not only for him, but also a guy who can potentially teach some things to the younger guys. Which again, part of that goes to the whole roster continuity and all those kinds of things. But just haven't really had that consistency year to year of guys that have experience that can show other people the ropes.
Okay, a couple more real quick before you go. Juwan Morgan, freshman. Kind of expected, I think, to be a steady guy. Obviously, now we'll have to take on, a little bit of a bigger role. But what do you think from Juwan? Is he a guy who meets, exceeds, or falls below expectations?
I think they're going to need him to I think that he's one of the expectations have probably changed, I guess maybe is the better way to say it. So maybe that becomes harder. I think the expectations have increased for him when you think about how many minutes we thought he might play or need to play early in the process versus what that looks like now. But again, I think it's nice to have a guy come in where there's enough experienced players on this team and enough guys that can score where you'd like to be able to go to a guy and say, look, here's the two things I need you to do out there. Go do these things and you're going to have a successful night. Instead of, guys kind of getting caught up in, I got to do, this on one end and this on the other and all these different things. I think they're, with the core group of guys that's back from last season, I think that there's a little bit more stability. I know there's been some roster turnover, obviously, with some of the guys that left, but really the key pieces are still there. And so to be able to mix and match some of these other guys around them feels less daunting than it probably has in years past. So I guess my expectations for him are not all that high because I don't think he needs to do a lot. But I do think there'll be games where he's going to need to log minutes and play well and just really stick to the fundamental things. As anybody who's listened to us knows in the past, I'm not a huge follower of recruiting, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've got a great scouting report on what he can and can't do. But I think he's in a situation where they're not going to ask him to do too much, but there'll certainly be times where he'll be asked to step in and play some minutes. I think he's got good enough size that he's in versatility where he can guard a couple different positions potentially, and really just activity level I think is going to be key. Just making hustle plays and things like that from a guy like him I think will be really key for the team.
Well, I think we agree those are the 9 rotation guys entering the season. Do you see OG Anunoby, Harrison Niego, Tim Priller, any of those 3 guys? Any thoughts on them? If you had to pick one of them to be a guy who, kind of steps up and ends up getting some minutes, does Niego step in because we don't have the guard depth? How do you see the roles for any of those 3 guys shaping up?
I guess I'll take Anunoby if for no other reason. I saw a tweet from John Rothstein, I think it was earlier this week, that talked about both he and Morgan, being rotation guys for IU this year. So I think that would at least suggest he's going to get the chance to play some minutes, and maybe that's 4 or 6 minutes a game. But again, I think he's a guy, athleticism-wise, has a chance to be a real asset on the defensive end, rebounding, just activity level. Some of the kinds of, I think Oladipo feels like the apt comparison for anybody who's really athletic and a little bit raw now that we get in here. So maybe we need to get another guy to compare to. And I don't necessarily put him on that level, certainly, but Victor, his freshman year, just would seem to get, timely offensive rebounds, just was in the right place at the right time, really hustled and did those kinds of things. So I feel like those are the kinds of things that Anunoby can do if he's given the chance to play. And those are the things that as a freshman on a team like this with some experience are going to earn you more playing time. And going to kind of, get you in a good place. So I would lump him and Morgan a little bit in the same boat. I think Morgan has a chance to play more right away. because he's got a little bit extra size, I think is generally a bit more skilled. But I think Anunoby, from the standpoint of being able to, good length, could defend some guards, could defend some wings, and really just activity level for a guy with, the kind of athleticism that it sounds like he has. I think he could really step in. And of the guys you mentioned, be there. I think Niego is a possibility, but I feel like that would be born more out of necessity than anything else.
Yeah, and I
Tim
do
Priller
hear
is Tim Priller. I think we all know what to expect from him, and I would expect he meets those expectations.
Yes, and OG is a guy that I hear does love being in the gym. It's interesting. You compare. There are the comparisons with Oladipo. OG is a guy that wasn't really on the recruiting radar, and I swear, if he ends up turning into an All Big Ten type player, Crean's going to just start finding athletic guys who have never even played basketball and are not on any recruiting radar, and just think that he can bring them in and turn them into players. Because it's like the degree of difficulty just keeps increasing. So we'll see if OG can do it, but I think he's certainly got the raw abilities, and it seems like he has the work ethic to do it. So we will see. Any final thoughts, Andy, before we send you on your way into the night?
No, I don't think so. I mean, always good to talk about this stuff. I'm really excited to see some of the young guys and the new guys. It's an interesting team in the sense that, like I said, there's this nucleus of guys who have been around the program for at least a couple years, and we have a pretty good idea of what to expect from them. And you've also got a lot of young guys who are going to be part of that rotation where you've got, the freshmen that we talked about and Bielfeldt coming in, who are all going to be right in that rotation that we talked about. So it's an interesting mix of players, and I think it'll be interesting to see in the early going how all that blends together, because I think that'll really be important, trying to get the roles sorted out. The rotation, obviously, as I'll probably lament at various times during the season, kind of how that all. I don't know. Somebody has to do it. So I think it'll be interesting to see that, but definitely excited to see this team play and at least get a glimpse of them on Saturday, and then look forward to talking about some actual games in the not too distant future. So it's right around the corner. I'm not giving up on the IU football team despite the gut punch from last weekend, but it is nice to have the hopefully the glimmer from IU basketball around the corner as well. So definitely excited to do that, and glad to be able to talk about this team.
Absolutely. Andy, thank you. We appreciate you being here, and
All
right. We'll talk. I think we're going to do another episode next Wednesday, so we'll talk to you then.
All right. Sounds good, man.
All right, man. Have a good night. All right, so we will keep going here for a little bit longer. If you have any questions, post them in the chat. I got a couple questions on Twitter earlier today that I wanted to address real quick. Jack Coburn asked, I think Max Bielfeldt is an X factor for this team. Indiana needs an off-court leader and an on-court leader. And we talked about that, absolutely. And I think that's the role that he can fill. And if he can do that while also putting up stats similar to what he did last year, and just being able to fill even maybe an inconsistent role on a nightly basis, like Andy was talking about, be ready for 5 minutes or be ready for 25. That's what Indiana really needs. And I think if Max can give that, it's going to really give this team something that it can count on and that can help stabilize, as maybe some of the other performances fluctuate a little bit game to game. But from your upperclassmen, you need those performances that you can count on. And so hopefully he can provide that. Let me get down to some of these others. Okay, so Nick asked, is Thomas Bryant more comparable to Cody Zeller or Noah Vonleh? We covered that. Aiken Hoosier asked us, it's way early, but fill in the blank. Indiana wins the Big Ten regular season title if, and he says you can't say defense, that's a given. Yes, we know Indiana's defense has got to improve. So Indiana can win the Big Ten regular season title if, number one, got to stay healthy. And again, that should be a given too. You need a guy like Thomas Bryant playing. I don't think Indiana can really afford to thin out, the depth that it has. But I really think that the two guys, if you want to look Indiana win the regular season title, that need to be consistent and really take the next step are James and Troy, because I think we know what Yogi's going to do, and I think he'll be a little bit better. We know what to expect from him. I expect Thomas Bryant to be a solid presence. And I think Robert Johnson, even last year, just like Alex said, when, with the eye test, it seemed like his effort and his focus were there, even if the results were a little bit inconsistent. But he's a guy that you really expect to be a steadier influence as a sophomore. And I look to James and Detroit, the two guys that were the biggest wild cards last year. You know, we know James had some games where he was scoring great and others where he wasn't. And I think that's got to become more consistent. And for this team to win a Big Ten regular season title, Troy Williams can't disappear against teams like Michigan State. He has to lead against teams like Michigan State. And that's the one thing last year that, well, we did see some growth with it. He was more consistent last year, but now as an upperclassman, he's got to get rid of those no-show games because this is a tough, competitive Big Ten season. Indiana is capable of winning every game, but we also know that this is a program that's been capable of losing every game. And I think the talent and the experience is there to where that floor is a little bit higher, and I don't worry about them dropping so much those random home games, although you've always got to be ready to play. But I think for them to truly step up and knock off the good teams, to go at Wisconsin and compete, even with a thinner Wisconsin team, you know, to play teams like Maryland and Michigan State and Purdue, Troy has got to be a guy that plays smarter and plays consistently. And so those two guys to me, you know, can Indiana win a Big Ten regular season title? They're the X factors to me. You know, if they're inconsistent, I think this is a third or fourth place Big Ten team. If they can bring it and be consistent, I think this is a team that can and very well may win the Big Ten title. So excellent question there. Daniel Zur asks, how do you think Elston is going to be able to help the team this season in his specific role? I think that remains to be seen. But I think Derek even said in some of his comments that he can kind of be a big brother figure to these guys. And I think in a program that has lacked internal leadership, for whatever reason, there's been a gap between what the coaching staff has been trying to communicate and what the players have been, well, certainly what they've been internalizing. You know, maybe they've been hearing the right messages, but they haven't internalized it. Maybe being able to hear it from a different source, and with it being from a guy who played with Victor Oladipo and played with Cody Zeller, maybe he'll have a different kind of credibility that can get through to these guys. It remains to be seen, of course, but I think that's the kind of impact that the coaches were hoping that he could have when they brought him in. And so hopefully that's the impact that he can have. Jason asks, you think Thomas Bryant will be playing in the exhibition games? I'm hoping so, as I bought floor seats to the November 9th game. I hope so as well, because I want to see him play. And frankly, you know, this team needs reps together with the new pieces that it has. And plus, these exhibition games are not going to be cakewalks. I mean, Ottawa and Bellarmine are both good teams that are going to be good tests for this Hoosier squad early in the season, where Indiana's going to have to play some good fundamental basketball. And so I hope to see Thomas Bryant. It's a wild card. You know, Indiana isn't always the most open program when it comes to injuries, nor should they be. All we know is that Thomas, you know, practiced that first 2-a-day practice and then has sat out a lot of the practices since. I'm not sure if he's back at practice now, but that just remains to be seen. I think if he plays in the exhibition games, that's an excellent sign that his health is okay, because I think if there's any question, then you hold him out of those games. So I think that is something to look for. You know, if he plays, then I think that assuages a lot of the concerns that maybe we have about his foot. Florida Hoosier asks a recruiting question. Deron Davis, how does one end up with Mississippi State and Indiana as their final two? I don't know. Maybe the same way that someone ends up rooting for Indiana basketball, USC football, and the San Diego Padres. I don't know. Little shot at Ryan while he's not here. What are our chances in that odd pair? Because Deron Davis actually had a final three. Was Arizona State, Mississippi State, and Indiana. You know, and I think here's the way that happens, I think a lot of times is Deron plays in Colorado. There's not a powerhouse basketball school in Colorado. I mean, you know, CU, hey, both my parents went there. I love Colorado University, but it's not a basketball power. And Deron has been a big-time recruit for a while. And so I think, you know, you've got obviously a program like Indiana that has obviously a lot of tradition and has been recruiting him for a long time. And, you know, you got a coach at, I think, what's his name? Howland's at Mississippi State now, right? So I think that's how you get him, you know, Mississippi State in your final two. And Arizona State just signed another big man, which is why, presumably why Deron has taken them off the list. I would say this about Deron. I feel really confident in him choosing Indiana, as confident as you can be just reading some reports about a high school kid that you've never met. But all the crystal balls and all the recruiting experts who know this stuff a lot more than I do seem extremely confident that IU will be the choice, to the point where I think it would be, you know, acceptable and expected for IU fans to feel disappointed if Duran doesn't choose Indiana, just because everything seems to be leaning that way. And then you've got a recruiting class of Duran and Curtis Jones. And I don't remember who I saw say this earlier today. Jerry Meyer, somebody, I don't know. Someone said this earlier today, that based on the commitments that have come in so far, that's a top 10 class with those two guys. Those are two really solid players. One guy who can step in and help in the backcourt immediately, and another big guy in Duran Davis who could step in immediately. And not knowing what Indiana is going to need next year based on the defections, clearly those are two guys who could have roles immediately. As CW notes, Jones will be coming to Hoosier Hysteria, so let's give him a nice big welcome. Those are all of the questions that I have. Let's see. Danny mentioned here, was in class with him today. He didn't look hobbled at all, but that's also class and not gameplay. I assume Danny's talking about Thomas Bryant there. And so agreed. Not much that we can tell there. I really don't think we'll know anything about his health. Certainly Hoosier Hysteria, if he's playing in the scrimmage, if he's dunking, that kind of thing, the stuff that is totally superfluous, then I think you can feel good about it. Jordan asked, any idea of the new walk-on Harrison Niego? Don't know a lot about Harrison, but we'll see. Hopefully, that Hoosier Hysteria, the scrimmage, is a nice place to see about those guys, and so hopefully we'll get a chance to see him then. All right, let's see if there's any more questions. If you all have any more questions, let me know. Okay, here's a good question, and this actually leads into what my final thought was going to be for tonight. So let's take this. Has your opinion of Crean changed at all after the Forbes article came out? That's what I wanted to address. Let me say this. I think it is a great article, okay? I think everybody should read it. We'll include it in the show notes. I've tweeted it out several times. If you missed this, there was an article from Forbes.com that Tom Crean, it says written by Tom Crean, and this is the issue that I have with this, okay? Is the article itself says written by Tom Crean, but it is under the contributor page of, is it Jordan Belzer, I think is the guy's name. But when you see that, the byline says written by Tom Crean. And I was initially very, very impressed with this article because it's a really good article, and it's articulate, and it's clear, and it's cogent, and it talks about these ideas of emotional intelligence and emotional agility and self-awareness. And it really seemed to me like a coach who has clearly read all kinds of self-improvement books and coaching books and all of this. And sometimes over Tom Crean's 7-8 years in Bloomington, I've wondered if he really has a firm grasp on some of these concepts that he's going through, because his explanations of them seem to be so frantic at times. And I've wondered if the reason why his messages seem to have struggled to get through to some of his players is because he's not great at clearly explaining them. I mean, the guy clearly has great ideas for leadership and teamwork, but they're conceptual. And I've wondered if he struggled to actually implement them in the heat of the battle, in the heat of the moment with people that he's leading, in those tough moments, as he says in the article, where you've got no good decision, but you have to make one anyway. And so part of why I was so excited about that article is I thought Tom Crean wrote it. And I am a writer. I do it professionally. Those of us who write know how hard good writing is, how difficult it is to clearly explain something. And to me, that would have been a real sign of growth if Tom Crean is able to articulate this stuff himself. Now, you learn in an interview with Kent Sterling that the co-author did, it was really more Tom Crean talking and him helping to distill some of this stuff. So some of my excitement over that, while maybe it's being nitpicky and maybe it was, maybe you shouldn't put that much stock in one article anyway, even if he did, assuming that he did write it, for whatever reason, I'm a little bit less excited about the article, but I still think, to answer this question, I am impressed, because here's what I'm impressed with is what I liked about the article is in an article about self-awareness, Tom Crean seemed to exhibit self-awareness by saying that the coach, the leader, is responsible for creating an atmosphere where his players can grow and develop the type of emotional agility that he's talking about. And for that to happen, it is incumbent upon the leaders and the organization to set the stage, to establish the framework, to set the boundaries for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And this has not been a program that has done that for a couple of years, where DUIs have gone underpunished and where guys have been given second and third chances. And Tom Crean has clearly made a change, dismissing Honor and Devin Davis, dismissing Emmett Holt. And he alluded in this article to the fact that some of the guys on the team maybe didn't understand that decision and maybe didn't even like it. And it almost felt like Tom Crean sensed some resentment about that decision, but he wasn't waffling on it. And I think what that showed was we are not doing a good enough job of setting the boundaries so that these guys know what is acceptable and what is not, so that they can then frame their emotional agility against some actual boundaries. And that's what leadership is, and that's what coaching and development is in a lot of ways. And so I thought the article showed that self-awareness, and I think that's what this program has been lacking, and that was my biggest takeaway. And I know people are going to focus on the part at the end where he talks about how he didn't offer a scholarship to a guy who was rude to his mom, and then that guy ended up becoming an all NBA player, and he would make that decision again. And I like that Tom Crean said that. He even said, maybe if the guy comes to me based on my values, I'm not able to reach him. Just because this other coach did doesn't mean I would be able to do that. And I think you really start to see a program grow and become consistent when a coach understands his strengths, when a coach understands his limitations, when a coach understands the guys that will work and the guys that won't work for him. And Crean said he did an exercise where he went through all the guys that he's recruited and whether he should have offered them a scholarship or not based on his gut instinct, and that his gut instinct has been right a lot of times. And I have no problem with a coach who is clearly examining those decisions, but is coming to a conclusion that he's trusting his gut instinct. Because for better or worse, you need your coach to trust his gut instinct because he can't lead if he doesn't. And so, if that proves wrong, then Tom Crean won't prove to be the long-term solution here, but he's got no chance if he doesn't believe. And if he doesn't have a framework for trusting that belief, and what I think the article articulated more than anything is that he is starting to trust, but more than that, he's starting to understand what he needs to do in terms of actions to establish the boundaries for the players so that they can start to come to the kind of understanding that he has as a 50-plus-year-old man. They can obviously only get to a certain level of that as young, impressionable, still immature 18 to 22-year-old young men. But he seemed to recognize that he can do a better job of getting them there. And that's what this program needs, because it's had talent. It just hasn't had the maturity, the consistency, the mental toughness. And if this article indicates that this program is able to take that next step, whether it's 5% or 10%, then I think that can that question earlier, what does Indiana need to do to reach the Big Ten title? That's how guys like Troy Williams and James Blackman become consistent performers, because that's the expectation, and what's expected inside the program helps them rise to that level consistently. And I just don't think there has been a great boundary set with this program, frankly. And I think there was when the guys were able to do it internally with Jordan Hulls and Victor Oladipo and Cody Zeller and Derek Elson and those guys, when it was more internal. And I think Tom Crean has struggled to do it himself. And that's what I took from the article, that he seems to have a better understanding of that. But there is nothing cheaper in this world than words on a web page. So that article means nothing if it's not backed up with action and if it's not backed up with long-term stability. And so I think we saw some of the action with dismissing Emmett Holt, which, whether that individual decision was fair or not, it's probably something that needed to happen for this program to establish the proper boundary. So that is at least an action that seems to match what we read in the article. If we continue to see actions like that, then I think we can trust it more. And I think that possibly we get this program back on that right track where it can start moving forward instead of doing the step forward, two back, step forward, two back, the kind of little song and dance that we've been doing over the Tom Crean era. Because isn't that the next step for all of us? We want to see this progress forward with some consistency and not keep taking these step back. So that is what I took from the article. But I can come up with your own take and comment on the post, because I'd love to know what other people think. And I know some people disagree with that. I've had some good conversations with people on Twitter. But I'm disappointed that Forbes put written by Tom Crean on there, because that's not accurate. And I think it devalues what writing is and how difficult writing is and what it means to say written by somebody. So I'm peeved by that, because it's false advertising. It's not accurate, and it doesn't. Anyway, I'll get off that soapbox. We have Hoosier Hysteria on Saturday, and that means the season is coming, and that is exciting. So I'll be watching on BTN Plus. I don't know if we're going to do a show after that. We haven't talked about it, but maybe we will. Watch Twitter. I'll also send an email to let you know if we're going to do that. And other than that, make sure you get on the email list, assemblycall.com/subscribe. We'll have another news roundup coming, and obviously you want to be on there so that once the post-game emails start, you're getting them and that you get all of our communications going forward. But thank you all very much for being here live. Really great turnout tonight. We really appreciate that. And thank you to everybody who is listening on the podcast, because you were the ones who make this worth doing. And we really appreciate all of your support of the Assembly Call, all the times that you share it with people, that you tell other people about it, and just when you open our emails, retweet our tweets, and show up for our shows. It makes a big difference. It keeps us excited. It keeps us motivated to do this. Let's get to the season, because it's here, and there's so much potential for it to be a good one. And I'm ready for it. I know you are. We will talk to you maybe after Hoosier Hysteria, certainly on Wednesday with another new show. And then after that, it's time to start doing some post-game shows, which will be a lot of fun. All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon on the next episode of The Assembly.